Welcome to Get Your Bell Rung Pro Wrestling Podcast. Guys, tonight's guest is someone whose journey through professional wrestling and life truly defines perseverance, passion, and reinvention. He is a former Minnesota professional wrestler who fans came to know as Gator Magraw, a charismatic cowboy-style competitor who built his reputation the hard way on the independent scene. From grueling training camps to traveling town to town, chasing the dream he lived, the reality that so many aspiring wrestlers only imagine. But his story did not end when he stepped out the ring. After his wrestling career, Mike Kinney transformed his experience into a new mission, becoming a motivational speaker, business leader, and author focused on confidence, leadership, and personal growth. His message has reached audiences from far beyond wrestling, including through his well-known talk about confidence and self-belief. What makes today special is that we are not just talking about wins and losses in the ring. We are talking about the sacrifices, the doubts, the moments of struggle, and the mindset it takes to rebuild your identity after a dream changes. This is a conversation about chasing purpose, overcoming fear, and finding confidence when life does not go according to plan. Guys, it's my pleasure to welcome former professional wrestler Gator Magraw, Mike Kinney. How are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for coming on. You know, one thing that one reason I was excited to have you on was not just talk about professional wrestling. That's how we met. But researching you, the things that I've learned about you, talking to people whose, as I said, dreams change, having to create even a new identity. I went through that. You know, I was injured in 2017. My whole world changed, became disabled. A lot of my goals and dreams literally wiped away from me, and I had to learn to redo those things, because if you don't, it's I think for most people, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but most people, we all have to have goals and dreams just in order for our everyday life to make sense, correct?
Yeah, I would imagine so. I think it would be tough for me to imagine a world where I'm not planning for something. You know, we all need to be working towards something. And so a life without that seems like a life that is lacking fulfillment in some way, I'm sure.
It is. Now, let's go back to your dreams and goals way back when you were the little Gator. Talk to me about when you first really got interested in professional wrestling.
Yeah, I grew up watching wrestling, and the first time I saw it, we were living in Iowa at the time. I was probably 4 or 5 years old, my earliest memory of wrestling. We didn't get AWA TV, which is kind of funny because it was just a few years later, when I was in kindergarten is when we moved to Minnesota for my dad's work. But I was introduced to the NWA, and that's what I knew of professional wrestling. And Dusty Rhodes, Four Horsemen, Nikita Koloff, all of those guys, I knew about them and watched them on TBS before I had any exposure to the AWA. By the time I moved to Minnesota, the AWA was already defunct. So I didn't have that root upbringing as a lot of Minnesotan wrestlers do, with the attachments to the AWA. But yeah, I mean, my dad was a huge fan, and we lived in rural southern Minnesota. We didn't get an opportunity. We didn't have a lot of money. You know, my dad worked at a meat packing plant, and we didn't get an opportunity to go to any big cities or anything like that to see any live professional wrestling. And it wasn't until I was a teenager. There was I tell the story in my book, but there used to be a bookstore in my hometown of Austin, Minnesota. And I would go in there at least once a week and just thumb through all the wrestling magazines. They had everything. I mean, the selection there were, in any given day while I walk in there, they have probably like 6 different wrestling magazines. And so I was learning about international wrestling. I was learning about domestic wrestling. I was learning about all of it just by thumbing through those magazines. And it wasn't until one day that the owner of that shop, he had a flyer that somebody had dropped off there of a local indie that was going to run. And he's like, "Hey man, I know that you like wrestling and everything. There's a show coming to town." And that was my first it was JB Trask's promotion. It was my first introduction to independent wrestling. I've never even seen a wrestling ring in person, but I knew that's the only thing I ever wanted to do growing up, was being a wrestler. I didn't have an interest in anything else.
Right.
And I submerged myself in it, and my parents were awesome about it too. Like, all my birthday parties were pro wrestling themed. All my buddies would come over, and whether they liked wrestling or not, we'd rent a couple of VHS tapes, and we didn't have cable either, man. So it was like, whatever tapes were coming out, that's what we were renting and watching. And yeah, I mean, my parents really were great in that regard, just to kind of like help continuously feed that fire for me.
Yeah. Now, and I may jump around a little bit, so forgive me, but I want to talk about, because something else, that you lost your dad at a young age, correct?
I did, yes.
And I went through that. I was in my early 30s when I lost my dad, but that loss really impacted me. And like yourself, my dad would watch professional wrestling with me. A lot of people ask why at your age you still watch professional wrestling. Well, one, because I like it, and two, it's still that connection to my father.
Yeah.
When you lost your dad, did that affect your desire to remain or to get into professional wrestling, or did you go through a point that it was too painful, you had to get away from that because of that loss?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had started breaking into the wrestling business when my dad was still alive. I was my first matches, I was either 16 or 17. My dad passed when I was 19, so he hadn't seen like the full development of the character I would later create. At the time when he passed, I was still, basically in the R&D version of trying to figure out who I was. But he never missed a show, man. And it wasn't like I was booked a lot. It was,
Right.
maybe one show every couple of months, but he was at all of them. And that was our thing, wrestling belonged to me and him. And I remember so specifically when he passed, I had a show booked that he passed on like a Tuesday or Wednesday, and I had a show booked that Saturday, and I needed to get out of the house so bad. The funeral was being held off for the following week, so it was just like a house full of people, man, and I just wanted to be around it. I showed up to the show, and I was getting ready for the match and everything, and I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. I was still kind of in shock because my sister and I are the ones that found my dad. He died unexpectedly. We didn't know it was coming, and he was very young. He was 44, which kind of freaks me out. I'll be 44 next month, so that's a whole other element. But I think about that day so often because one of the guys who I developed my wrestling training with, Sheriff Johnny Emerald, is the guy that had approached me. And the whole locker room kind of knew what was going on. And because my dad was he was around it so much, the guys they couldn't help notice he wasn't there. They didn't expect to see me. And I was just kind of getting ready in the locker room. I didn't wrestle. I ended up not wrestling that night. I just couldn't get my act together. And everybody kind of left me alone in the locker room. And he had come over to me, Sheriff did. And I just kind of vented, I was sad and I was still in shock. And I told him I didn't even know why I was going to do this anymore or what I was doing. I didn't know. I was a kid, man. I was 19. And I just remember he said so specifically that the best wrestlers are just themselves, but turned up. And we had this long conversation about it. And that's one of those moments that I look back on that really did change my life. And I know he didn't intend for that to happen. My relationship with Sheriff later on became, depending on which way the wind blew, became off and on good and bad. But I will always, hold him dearly in my thoughts, just for kind of pointing me in that direction on that day, because that's what I needed.
Right. You started training in 1998. Mm-hmm. When you first got into the business, the training aspect of it, was it exactly what you expected, or was there a reality check there?
What a lot of people don't know about my training, it was very unconventional. And I got called a yarder from time to time, but here's the truth about my training. When the local independent shows would come to town, I would show up early, and a couple of the younger guys would bump me around and they would show me the moves, or they would show me how to run the ropes. They would show me just the basics, right? And keep in mind, I'm like 16 still. And there was a camp that was being run in northern Iowa by a couple of these guys, and they invited me and a couple of other guys I was friends with down to that camp. And it was more of them kind of like sitting in lawn chairs and watching us do stuff and giving us pointers along the way. And we kind of took that, me and this group of guys who later on made a huge impact on the Minnesota wrestling scene, but we took all of that and we started running our own shows and booking outside talent. And so now here we are in a position where we're trying to learn the craft and booking shows, and just like, it was like almost like a wrestling fraternity. A lot of us lived together. It was pretty amazing to think about that now on how we all came up. But that's initially how I broke in. In 2001 is when I had my introduction to Sheriff Johnny Emerald, and that's when I decided to start training with Midwest Pro Wrestling in the Twin Cities. And I continued to do that. I would go to their training 2 or 3 days a week. It was a 2-hour drive each way. And then I developed along with them. And then a couple of years later, I went to like a week-long camp with Harley Race and Ricky Steamboat.
Wow.
And worked out with them quite a bit. So, and the great thing about that camp was, I know what people are like, oh, it's a seminar. It wasn't a seminar. We slept there. I mean, we were there all week. It was all day long. There were no breaks. And my buddy and I, who was wrestling as Casanova at the time, we were the only 2 guys there that were trained. Everybody else were guys that were like wanting to break into the business. So since we were the only guys that were trained, we got a lot of ring time with Harley, a lot of ring time with Ace Steele, Trevor Murdoch, and Les Thatcher was there. I mean, it was Ricky Steamboat got in the ring with us. It was awesome. So we really got white glove treatment, because by that point we'd had, 50 matches at least a piece by the time we got to that level.
Wow. Man, between Harley Race, Ricky Dragon Steamboat, Trevor Murdoch, was there one that you were drawn to more than any of them? And was there one that you learned more from than any of them, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Trevor was awesome in the fact that Trevor was trying to get me. So the camp was in Missouri, and Trevor was really trying to get me to move to Missouri after the camp was over with. He and I had many long talks, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And looking back on it, still don't know what the right answer about that is. But at the time, Harley was running that camp, and a lot of guys that were working for Harley were getting booked in Noah in Japan, and they were also getting booked as development talent for WWE. So Trevor was like, look, man, we don't know how long Harley's going to be around. He's Harley. And so you get to learn under Harley. You get to come to the dojo and just, and you get all that exposure. And Trevor was great at the camp for showing us the ins and outs. Ricky is very approachable. Ricky is the first wrestler that I'd ever come across that was very insistent that the cardiovascular side of the professional wrestling performance needed to be pristine. I didn't ever get that a lot when I was breaking in. Nobody ever really talked about it. That was the first time I'd ever had been exposed to the way that the intermittent cardio, Ricky was huge about that and gave us a lot of pointers on physical fitness and those kinds of things. Now, Harley, I'll talk about Harley for a second. So Harley and his wife, they were very gracious. His wife was a sweetheart. She looked at all of the wrestlers as an extension of her family. So whatever we needed, anything, she was great. Harley was, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. Harley was amazing.
Right.
But Harley didn't interact with everybody because Harley was kind of at the tail. He had a tough time getting around. So he didn't get in the ring very often with us. Ricky did. Ricky was great.
Right.
Harley would stand ringside and, essentially call traffic. But I remember on one of the days of the camp, and it was summertime in Missouri and the building was not air conditioned and it was hot, man. And we were sweating all day and we stunk. And I was very intimidated by Harley because Harley Race, and I'm the
Harley Race.
He's legit, dude. And so he had his NWA. I remember he had an office there. He had his NWA World Championship up behind him in the office. Very intimidating. And he got in the ring one day and he had asked me to come into the ring with him because we were comparable in size, and he wanted to show everybody foot placement on when you're putting a headlock on somebody.
Right.
And bro, I was sweating it because I'm just like, man, if I lose my balance, Harley's going to fall over. And, like just worst case scenarios, like running through my mind. And Harley put a headlock on me and we're standing there. And I don't know if I was quivering or what was happening, but he had my head and he leaned down and he said, "Are you nervous, kid?" And I looked up at him. I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Don't worry about it." And after that, Harley and I were great. Like it was the most bizarre icebreaker ever, but he was cool. But you didn't want to cross him either. Like the other guys told us, don't piss around when he's here, because, and not that we were, but just like they gave us kind of the lay of the land on what Harley expected. And he ran a tight ship.
Yep. I've never met Harley race, but I've met his son. His son, matter of fact, has been on the podcast. And just going according to pretty much the same description from everyone that has trained on New Harley race, his son is much like his dad as far as that persona, right? And I'm not a guy that intimidates very easily. And I'm not going to say his son intimidated me, but there was that something there that it was hard to describe. And I have to imagine that's how Harley race was. And what's funny is his son is an amazing guy, an amazing man. And Harley was described the same way, as he had that persona about him and you didn't want to mess with him, but he was an amazing guy.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what it felt like to be able to have that on your resume. No, because look, there's not a whole lot of wrestlers, especially your age, where you're in your same age, we're close, you and I, to have that Harley race with someone that you got in the ring with, on top of, Ricky, the Dragon Steamboat, Trevor Murdoch. Did business pick up for you after being with those guys? In other words, did you see more bookings than ever before?
I was getting booked a lot already, and I had the marketing element to the professional wrestling business down very early on. And I understood what it took to kind of get your name out there. I was sending tapes and 8x10s, and I was trying to get booked everywhere. I had a great website. I was advertising on my ring gear. I mean, I was doing it. Did I get booked more? I probably did. I remember specifically coming back and thinking about the business a little bit differently, in the fact that, like, I made the conscientious decision when I got back to start doing more musical theater, believe it or not, because I wanted to have more live interactions to work on my promos. And so I thought, if I can take this musical theater thing on, perhaps it'll help me in a live performance in wrestling and just enhance what I already have. So I was looking at it just like that. It was like any other thing that I thought might be able to add to my resume, I was doing it. So, yeah, man, it wasn't uncommon for me to work 2, 3, 4 days a week sometimes. And as an independent wrestler in the upper Midwest, there wasn't a lot going on at that time. So the only way to do that is to travel. And I was traveling. At one point, I was one of the only wrestlers out of Minnesota. Many guys way more talented than me, by the way, from a wrestling skill set perspective. But I was marketing myself at such a high level. I was getting flown. I was one of only like 2 or 3 guys in the whole state that were getting flown across the country to wrestle. And, I remember that, not taking that for granted either. I knew exactly why I was getting booked and exactly why I was getting on those planes. And other people were not. It was just, I was such a student of the game. And looking back on it, there's some things I probably should have worked on more, but like, I had that marketing stuff dialed in, and that was paying dividends for me. So after the Harley race thing, that's when I started to kind of wet my chops about wanting to go to Japan.
Right. I want to ask you a couple of questions on a couple of things that you said. One, wrestling skill, but before we get to there, the artsy side of you, the side that, you wanted to take these different classes to help you out. Being in Minnesota, was that something that made it more accessible for you? Because Minnesota, well, it is in today's world, Minnesota, very artsy. If you're into the arts, by God, Minnesota's a state for you to be in. People think of California, and rightfully so, and Seattle, get rightfully so. Minnesota has to be in that conversation, though, right? Back in those days, was Minnesota this artsy place like it is now? And if so, did that open up more doors for you because of you being located here?
It was starting to emerge as that. I had a very, very close relationship with my high school art teacher, and he helped me make a lot of my wrestling t-shirts and stuff like that. He was helping me with the imagery. I was very close with a professor from the community college in that same town that has a brilliant mind for musical theater, whom I'd known when I was a small child doing musical theater. He was still there. And so I had begun building a relationship with him and subsequently went to that community college for a couple of years so that I could study under him. There were just those kinds of, I was kind of looking intentionally for people who would teach me the verticals that I thought would enhance what I was already doing. So I was very cognizant about it, but it was very available. It wasn't like I had to look very hard.
Right. Let's talk about what you're talking about with wrestling skill. You made the comment that, talent-wise, there's a lot of guys that were, more talented than you, but weren't traveling and getting booked like you were. And you say it's because of marketing yourself. Wasn't that, I'm sure it was, or do you think that had something to do with the fact that you may not have been as good in the ring as these guys were, charisma-wise? You kind of had the edge. I can tell you that the past, year and a half, since I started this podcast, I've been very fortunate. I've met the right people. I've been around with a lot of professional wrestlers and guys that are amazing in the ring, but they just didn't have that charisma. I met you, you're good in the ring, but you're definitely that you're charismatic. You have that charisma going for you. Do you think it was more of the charisma thing versus, you put your marketing yourself, or do you think it was equal?
I think that my charisma certainly helped me get my foot in the door a lot of places. When I probably don't give myself enough credit for the wrestling aspect of it. I was a very sound wrestler.
No, absolutely.
I could chain wrestle if I wanted to. But you have to understand, when I broke in with a bunch of guys that were doing backflips and all that kind of shit, right? So I had to learn how to be a post. I was the guy catching everybody. So from a flashy elements perspective, I wasn't the guy. And that was kind of a tough pill for me to swallow early on because I was training with cruiserweights and I was not a cruiserweight. And I knew that. But I also knew that I was going to get really good at catching these guys, which later on in my career became really beneficial for me. But I learned a lot of technical wrestling through that. I mean, Eric Cannon was at that school, and chain wrestling with him for 15 minutes will straighten you out pretty quick. And I remember I had a booking one time. I don't know if you know a wrestler named Chad Collier.
Mm-hmm.
So Chad was involved in the early Ring of Honor days. And I remember watching him. He's very Dean Malenko-esque. He actually got trained by Dean Malenko, which is very ironic. But he and I did a couple of shots together out in North Carolina. And he and I got booked against each other. And he said, "What do you want to do tonight?" And I said, "Look, man." And I really admired his work. And I said, "I'm not great at the chain wrestling. I can hold my own, but I would love to get in there with you and just grapple around. And if I can't get out of something, you just kind of feed me through and I want to learn from you." And because I approached him in that way, I look back on that match and I'm just like, I can't believe I actually did that. Like he and I, it wasn't a Ring of Honor level match, but it was far better than anything from a technical perspective that I'd ever been exposed to. And so long story longer, I could hold my own. I just knew that my charisma was going to carry me a lot further than nobody needed me to be a technical wrestler. Nobody needed me to be a high flyer. They needed me to show up and entertain and be something different, because at that time in the Midwest market, specifically in Minnesota, it was a bunch of dudes that were either doing backflips and real small, or they were guys who looked like they belonged in the UFC. And they were doing those kinds of moves. And that's why I developed the cowboy character, because nobody was doing that around here. And it was so different. I knew it was going to get me booked. So that's one of the reasons I ended up going with the cowboy. But yeah, the charisma thing probably, it's a weird thing to hang your hat on, but I I do agree with you. Yes.
Well, I mean, look, you're definitely you're solid in the ring. Fans, I had the privilege of witnessing Mike Kinney's last match, his retirement. And I swear to you, true story. After I watched that match, I literally looked at my wife and I said, "He remind." And I apologize. I know wrestlers hate this because they hate being compared to anyone. They want to be there. Mike Kinney wants to be Mike Kinney, not the so and so. But it's true. I say, "God, this guy reminds me of Hangman Adam Page," and it wasn't just because of the cowboy gimmick that you had going on. It's because the way you moved in the ring, right? A lot of your move sets. And I went, how is he not someone that came from one of the three top promoters?
Well, thank you. That's very complimentary. I appreciate that.
But going back to your training in '98, man, you broke into business at a very unique time. Professional wrestling had once again exploded, right? We went from early '90s to mid '90s, the whole cartoon gimmick crap, to the NWO, which made it explode to reality-based wrestling. Stuff that I grew up watching actually was more reality-based. NWA, as you said, right?
Yeah.
Do you think breaking in the business at that time helped you, or did it hinder you because of that time? Because I have to admit, I had a friend of mine during that time went to Shawn Michaels Wrestling School in Texas. And when he got back, he was like, man, he's like, I was told that there's more people trying to get into professional wrestling right now because of the explosion than ever before. And he's like, that makes it harder. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah. Because like I said, it was a very flooded market. And it was kind of a strange thing happening also is that kayfabe was still very much alive. So there were guys that had been around a long time on the independent circuit. Some had done shots in New York. I mean, some had been around and then they were kind of on their way out. And so that's kind of when I met them, on my way up, and they were on their way out, right? So you kind of cross over at some point. And they were very jaded about the direction that the pro wrestling business was going. And being a wrestling fan was frowned upon. Watching wrestling was frowned. Collecting wrestling figures, being involved in wrestling in any way, you were looked at as a mark. It was a taboo thing. Yep. You didn't talk about
trash,
it. You didn't
baby. You were white trash.
Yep. And if you were one of those guys that didn't party in the locker room and talked about your wrestling figures or whatever, right? They would very quickly blacklist you and you would be on the outs everywhere. And it was just like, you just had to keep your shit together because it was just like, these guys will teach you, but they were still very much gatekeeping the wrestling business and not wanting some of these newer talents to thrive. And so there were a lot of conflicts with guys that were kind of in my tenure coming up with guys who were, had 30 years of experience on their way out. Lots and lots of conflict because the old guard didn't want to change, right? And so it was just like, it was such a change in the wrestling business happening all around us. And it was scary for those guys because they weren't able to. ECW was hot as fire. And so everybody wanted to do gimmick matches because of it. Everybody wanted to get color because of it. And I mean, it was changing so fast that some of those old timers, that's the one thing I wish that I got in the wrestling business 5 years sooner because I would have had time to settle in and learn from those guys before they were totally jaded to the direction the wrestling business was going.
Right. You mentioned Dean Malenko. My co-host, Bob Cook, the Cooker, was trained by the great Malenko.
Yeah.
He went on to have a decent career. And I also had Joe Malenko. I had Joe on my podcast.
Cool, yeah.
And I told Joe this. I don't understand why the Malenkos aren't in the same conversation with the Harts, right? When it comes to technical wrestling. You talk about technical wrestling, everybody immediately goes to Bret Hart or the Hart family.
Yeah.
The Dean Malenko, and some people, I promise you I'm going to get hate for this, in many ways was either equal or better than, in my opinion, when it came to technical wrestling. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the Malenkos don't get the credit that they rightfully deserve in the business? Yeah, they get mentioned, but not like they should, man.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think, you know, the the wrestling business is very political.
Mm-hmm.
And if you cross the wrong person, um, it can alter the perception of your legacy very quickly. And I think that I'm not saying that the Malenkos had heat with anybody, but
Right.
I think on the other side of that, the Harts were um, had such a great relationship with Vince McMahon and everybody in New York that they had the exposure to seem like they were more important. I think
Yes.
that both dynasties are, great, both of them in their own rights.
Absolutely.
But I do think that some of that, is politically based.
Right. Right. And on on Wednesday, I'm going to have Ross Hart on. So Ross, if you see this, man, I love you, man. I'm just saying, Ross. But talk to me about Dean Malenko. Talk to me. What is the thing that out of everything that you learned from him, what is that one thing that not only did you carry throughout your wrestling career, but to this day, you can still use it with your motivational speaking and just your everyday life?
With Dean Malenko?
Yeah.
I didn't get trained by Dean Malenko.
Oh, I thought you said Dean Malenko trained you.
No. Harley Race, Sheriff
Right.
Johnny Emerald.
Okay.
No, I said Chad Collier got trained by Dean
Oh,
Malenko.
Chad.
So Chad,
Okay.
yeah, that's what I said. Chad was like a very much a version 2 of
Okay.
Malenko. That's what he was striving to be like.
Yep. I apologize. I misunderstood that. Let's talk about you on the independent scene. Wrestling on the indie scene can be physically and financially brutal. What sacrifices do you feel like that you've made in order to continue your career at the time on the indie scene? And did that affect relationships with the people in your life?
Yeah, I was going to say relationships is probably the first thing that I would say had to take sacrifices. There's a lot of jealousy amongst the boys.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say that, amongst wrestlers, at least there used to be.
Right.
I was not immune to that. There were guys that I was jealous of, guys that I was close with, and we were all jealous of each other in some way, and whether we wanted to admit it or not. And I think that gets in the way sometimes of being as successful as you possibly can be instead of working together. There were 1 or 2 or 3 guys that, we always felt like we were working against each other. We've all mended the fence now, but it was hard for a while with some of us because we were so close coming up in the business, and then you just get so competitive. You're like brothers, man. And not to throw that brothers term around, but we truly were. We were all living together. We were all traveling together. So over time, those relationships had to be sacrificed in some way so we could all spread out and kind of start doing our own things, which was important as well. My body took a beating. I mean, I figured in the 10 years that I worked, I had 500-ish wrestling matches. I had 2 full-blown shoulder surgeries. I had to have surgery on my nose because I got it smashed after a guy hit me in the nose with his knee during a moonsault. I broke both my hands in one match. And I'm missing. I have like right now, I have this like weird pelvis issue. I'm assuming it's from bumping and whatever, or maybe bumping incorrectly at some point. But or maybe it was the leg drops I used to do off the top of my barn. Yeah. Maybe that was it, off the top of the barn onto the grass. I'm sure that was part of it, being a backyard wrestler. But no, I think that, but you do have to sacrifice some of your body to make that happen.
Right.
And money. Man, I definitely spent more on the wrestling business than I made over that whole period of time, without a doubt. I just think that you don't look at it as a sacrifice at the time. You're traveling around, mostly getting paid sometimes on, getting to travel with somebody else kind of paying for it. I mean, And even when they didn't, man, it was still fun. You'd pack a car full of guys. You'd fly down the highway 6 hours each way to go to a show. If you're lucky, you got enough money to buy a pack of bologna for all the guys in the car, and you split that. You always have enough money for beer back then. I don't know how that happened, but we always did. Maybe if we stay at a Red Roof Inn and there's 2 beds and 4 of us, we pull the mattresses off the box springs and flip a coin to see who gets the box spring. I mean, we were living like rock stars, except
Right.
there was no money. I mean, the money that the guys make on the independent circuit in the Twin City area now floors me, because I mean, and I realize there's a 20-year differential between when I got out of the wrestling business and now, but it's substantially different. And so back then it was just like I had to sell merch and move merch in order to make any kind of money whatsoever. But anyway, sacrifices. The one sacrifice that I don't really talk about, and I probably need to, wasn't by me. It was by my girlfriend, who was in college, and we lived an hour apart from each other while she was in school. And the only time we'd get to see each other was on the weekends. And most of the time I was booked. And so the only chance she would get to be with me was by traveling with me to these shows. And I ended up marrying her. We've been together 26 years, and we've got 3 awesome kids together. But she don't like wrestling, man. She never did. She just wanted to be there with me. And she sacrificed a lot of her time and her life to be with me. And yeah, I don't want to discredit her at all for that.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
look, I get it. My Teddy Long and Mac Davis, 2 great men. Teddy Long, of course, both of them in professional wrestling. Teddy's a legend. Last year, we were at an event with my wife, and Teddy and Mac, they came to me, and they were like, "Man, every time we see your wife, we kept on saying that woman must love him, because we could tell she's not a wrestling fan because she's sitting down while you're doing whatever you have to do, and she's not." My wife jokes around and says all the time, "I know more about what she says. She knows more about professional wrestling than she ever thought that she would."
Yeah, that's how it works.
We do. We have to give credit to our spouses for supporting us, and because they can make our lives miserable if they wanted to.
Yeah.
With them not being fans. Talk to me about Gator Magraw, the character, because I'm going to be honest. When I first met you, Gator Magraw, I'm originally from Louisiana. I went, this guy has to be from the South, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, something. Nope, Minnesota. Now, I know you said part of it, they didn't have any cowboy characters when you got into the business. But Gator Magraw, man, what tell me how that came about, and what does Gator Magraw represent to you personally?
So the development of the character itself is a lot. It's a lot easier than anybody thinks. So at the time when I was getting ready for match 1. Okay. I didn't want to be Mike Kinney because I didn't see the appeal to that. Plus I was a minor, and I didn't want to risk getting in trouble for whatever reason. The other thing was I was playing high school football. And when I was doing that, during football season, I wasn't wrestling. I wasn't allowed to because I was technically getting paid as a pro to wrestle. And so the school was pretty adamant about that. And so I thought by changing my name, that might give me some kind of, edge, I guess. And I couldn't think of anything. And it was like last minute. I had a big poster from a WWF magazine on my wall in my bedroom of Skinner. And I just thought it was such a cool photo. This like rough dude with a beard. He's got the chew drip coming down his face. And behind him in that photo was the skin of an alligator. It was like hanging as like drapery. And I was just like sitting there staring at between that and my poster of Pamela Anderson. And I was like, all right, Pamela Anderson's great. Gator, I'll look at Gator. And so I was just like, Gator, huh? And I kind of tossed it around. I'm like, oh, I'll just go with Gator. And I can change it later. It doesn't matter. It's just my first match. So I just went with Gator. It was just plain Gator. And just never got around to changing it. I didn't know, I played with the idea of doing like a mobster gimmick with it. And it just wasn't into it. I didn't understand the whole mob thing. And I was like, I'll just keep being this Gator guy. I was wearing a t-shirt and camouflage pants, and I didn't even have wrestling boots yet. I just wore work boots. And I remember when it came time to buy the actual wrestling boots, I had enough money to do that. It was like, well, should I change my name? And then there was an option to have the reptile skin boots. And I was like, well, I think I'm going to stick with Gator. So I did for no reason whatsoever. I just stuck with Gator. And when I started getting more consistent work and being able to look at the market and go, okay, nobody's going to book me if I'm wearing a t-shirt and pants. I got to do something different. I'm going to take a risk. What's it going to be? And by that point, I lost my dad, and I really wanted to do like I always loved Dusty, Dusty, and especially when you did the Midnight Rider gimmick and all that. And in that, and you appreciate the NWA too, there was always those rough and tough cowboys, and I grew up on a farm, and I was like, you know what? I wanted to do something that kind of allowed me to see myself through my dad's eyes, because he was a big dude and very, very blue collar, didn't want to mess with him. And I thought that a cowboy was going to represent a man's man better than anything else. And so and at my uncles and stuff did rodeo. And so it wasn't that much of a stretch for me. Right. I understood the lifestyle. But at that point, all I had was Cowboy Gator. I was like, I need a last name, because that was kind of the way the evolution of wrestling. Everybody was kind of changing to real names and things like that. But I didn't want to use Kinney. It just didn't ring. And I'll never forget, I had my own apartment at the time, and I was sitting on my couch, and I was literally flipping through the channels, and they were talking about the CMA awards on this commercial, and they flashed an image of Tim McGraw up there. And I was writing names down. It was like Brooks from Garth Brooks, and Jackson from Alan Jackson, and and then Tim McGraw came up there, and I wrote down McGraw. I even wrote down Hansen because of Stan Hansen, whom I loved. And so I started pinging some of these last names off the guys that I was wrestling with. Like, what do you think? What do you think? And the one that we all agreed on was McGraw. And I thought, okay, this is probably the one change I wouldn't have done looking back on this. I didn't want the spelling to be the same.
Right.
So I changed it from Mick, M-C-G-R-A-W, to M-A-G-R-A-W, which got misspelt a billion times after that in any wrestling poster that I was on. But that's how it developed. It was like, it was in stages, and it just kept building on top of itself as I went through the development of who I was going to be.
We're at 42 minutes right now, Mike. There's so much I want to talk to you about, because what you did after professional wrestling, I really want to lay foundation down with that, because it's so important. Do you mind? We're still going to keep on going here, an hour, who's ever going to, but do you mind us having a part two? Me schedule you to come back so we can.
Yeah, let's do it, man. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk to you about, bitterness. When you were younger, a young guy in a business, was there a time that you went through that you were seeing other professional wrestlers that you knew you were better than, right? That was getting the call-ups, that were getting major contracts. Was there a time that you felt like, why am I getting passed up? And was there ever bitterness that creeped in? And if so, how did you get rid of that? And if bitterness never played a part, how did you avoid that?
Yeah, I could think of one very specific example of this. There was a wrestler whom he and I were great friends, and we were so competitive with each other that we were driving a wedge in between us. We're totally cool now. But back then, we went from being almost best friends to being almost strangers to each other. And I remember so specifically, I was such an ECW fan. I was doing everything that I could to get a booking at the ECW arena. Like, I had two dreams in wrestling that I didn't get to complete. Ironically, I got booked for both of them. One was wrestling in the ECW arena, and the other one was wrestling in Japan. I got both of those opportunities to do that, and I personally screwed them up. And so I take the fault for that. But this was early on in my career that this guy whom I was friends with, and now we were on the outs, got the booking at ECW arena. And it was around the 4th of July. I remember that because I was watching the fireworks or something, and somebody told me that he had done the match, or was doing the match, or was there in Philly, or whatever it was. And I was so stinking jealous. I mean, I was pissed. in hindsight now, I'm so happy that he got that opportunity to do that. What a great honor to be able to do that. But back then, I was so driven and self-centered about where I was going that I didn't look at it through that lens. And I don't know if bitter is the right word, but it made me angry. It made me resent him a little bit more. But it also made me work harder. I knew that he was a better in-ring wrestler than I was, and it made me want to up my game. So that's the fuel. I took that as fuel to
Right.
continue to move on. Yeah.
Right. I'm not going to go past what you said, how you screwed up ECW New Japan. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I had gotten booked for a show. So I toured with the Insane Clown Posse.
Mm-hmm.
And
that had to be interesting.
Yeah, it was to say the least.
We'll get to that.
But through that opportunity, I was touring with them and doing their JCW stuff. And Madman Pondo was good buddies with Todd Gordon, and Todd Gordon was running shows at the ECW arena. And Pondo and I were just talking. We were on a tour bus together, and we were traveling all over the country. So after the shows, we were all just partying on the bus and just shooting the breeze and whatever. And Pondo called Todd while I was sitting there and put him on speakerphone. And Todd essentially told him, "Yeah, bring him in. We'll do this." And then subsequently, the same thing happened. It was for Big Japan Wrestling. Pondo was the gaijin that was booking the Americans for that. And Pondo was like, "Green light, man, you're in." And I had a falling out with the Insane Clown Posse, and I didn't get to finish my committed time with them. And that created some serious heat with me and those guys because I didn't ask for permission to leave. I just left. And they were, and again, I was, in hindsight, I shouldn't have done any of that. That was all on me. But I screwed that up for myself. Also, it was also the final year that I had in wrestling, and I knew that I was leaving the business because my shoulder was so banged up. It's almost like I self-sabotaged it, knowing that I couldn't perform at the level that I wanted to for either Japan or ECW arena. But I had both of them like in my grasp. I'm the one that messed those opportunities up. Nobody else did that but me. So, and it's the same thing at the end of that 2 nights after I left the tour with the Insane Clown Posse. 2 nights, I was supposed to work a match with Muda. And the Great Muda is one of my all-time favorite wrestlers of all time. And I was so excited to work with him because I knew that I was going to Japan. I knew Muda, right? I was borrowing from some of his character development, and I obviously didn't get that either. So I self-sabotaged at the end of my wrestling career. I was fighting addiction and all kinds of nasty stuff. And I think in looking back on that, I probably did that to myself because I knew I wasn't the wrestler I was a year before that, before I got hurt.
Right. What is the hardest lesson professional wrestling taught you?
The hardest lesson?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the hardest lesson that I learned from that is that we're taught when we grow up that you can be anything you want to be, but nobody ever says you can be anything you want to be until you can't.
Right.
And then what's the rest of your life look like?
Right.
That's the piece that I wish I would have focused a little bit more on. Was I didn't have a plan B. I was all in on professional wrestling, and I was so closed-minded to the idea that wrestling wasn't my destiny, that even if you would have told me, "Mike, you're going to get hurt, you're going to have to figure out something else," I would have called you a liar. I would have been angry with you because nothing was going to get in my way. And then I ended up being the one that got in the way of myself, So I think that was the toughest thing, was like, I left wrestling and I really fought depression for about 5 years. And it was because I lost that identity that I had. Gator, like it's such a strange thing to like be this character for so long and be working towards something. And then when you don't have that character anymore and you're mainly not working toward that thing, that goal, it's like, what am I doing with my life? I don't I don't have dreams and aspirations. They were, I did them already. And when you've lived your dream at such a young age, you look at any NFL player, they're lucky to make it 2 or 3 years if they make it to the NFL. Their whole life has been spent playing football. Maybe they won the high school, maybe they won their state championship, and maybe they were national champions in college. And then they get to the NFL, maybe they only make the practice squad and then they get cut. They're only, in their mind, they're a football player. And it's like, what do you do after that? Nobody prepares you for that at any level. It's no different than somebody working a career for 25 years and getting laid off. Like, that's part of your identity. Nobody prepares you for the layoff. And I think that, when you and I do part 2, we got to dive into that, because I experienced that exact thing later on. That was kind of like the second phase of my life.
Yeah. Absolutely. You mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that you dealt with addiction.
Yes, sir.
Talk to me about that time in your life, and how did it begin? What I know, so many professional wrestlers, it always seems like it begins with an injury. What was your experience?
Mine didn't begin with an injury. Mine began because I was a kid that was out partying too hard after his dad died. I did not drink in high school. I didn't have my first drink until, so my addiction was alcohol. I'm an alcoholic.
Okay.
I have been sober now for over 10 years, almost 10 and a half years. And it wasn't always like that. I think that, I didn't drink in high school. I started drinking a little bit with my buddies the summer after we graduated. And then my dad passed away the following year, and I was devastated. I started drinking some, but not a lot. I kind of got into the college party scene a little bit, because during all this, I was going back to school to get my bachelor's degree. And so I was just like a normal party guy. It didn't really start to become an issue, because my issue was never frequency. It was always volume. So if I was going to drink, we were going to drink a lot. And so I think that once my time wrestling ended, I didn't know what else to do. And drinking made me feel better. And I always feel guilty about that, because during that time, my wife and I had our 3 kids, and I should have been like, hey, I'm a dad, and nothing's better than this. And while that's true, I didn't realize that depression and alcohol dependency had really taken their grasp on me. And it became a slippery slope. Now, I'm one of the lucky ones that I didn't get in trouble with the law or anything like that in that regard, but it was a matter of time, because I was making some really stupid decisions and stuff that I should have gotten pinched for and didn't. And, I hurt a lot of people. I said a lot of things, not physically, but I said a lot of things to a lot of people when I was messed up, and most of them I've apologized to on my own recognizance, not because I'm part of a program, but I think that the injury wasn't it. It was the depression that made it worse for me.
Right. I was drinking a lot after my father passed away. Is how I was coping, very unhealthy. My aha moment was when I got DUI. Like, what are you doing? You got a kid. What was your aha moment?
Oh, I don't know how proud I am to say this. I've never said this publicly, so you're the first one. I was in sales. I was entertaining a customer. We were at a Minnesota Twins game. I drank way too much at that game. I got blackout drunk. My little girl was with me, and I drove her home, and I have no memory of it. Anything could have happened. I put so much at risk. When I woke up the next morning, everybody was gone, and there was an ultimatum on the table for me, but I didn't need it. I knew that it was my family or it was the alcohol, and I never looked back. I haven't drank since. I chose them. I needed to do that. So it was time.
You ended your career at a fairly early age in professional wrestling. Was there a reason that you decided to end your career? You talk about suffering your shoulder, or was it you knew that it was time to go into the next phase of your life, which we'll be getting into, which was speaking to people?
Well, the speaking to people thing didn't happen for about 10 years after I got out of wrestling. What happened was is I got injured. I thought it was getting better in my shoulder. My shoulder would dislocate on its own, and I was using a clothesline as a finish, so it was dislocating during my finish, and it was getting worse and worse and worse to the point where I would just be stretching out in the locker room and it would dislocate. So I went and had the first surgery, and I was out about 3.5 months. I went back to the ring way too soon. I was not ready, and I didn't take the physical therapy very seriously. I just wanted to go back to wrestling. And because I went back too soon, I re-injured it after a surgery severely. I mean, it was bad. And I went and seen a surgeon at the Mayo Clinic who had done a lot of work on the Minnesota Vikings. And she was doing stuff on a case-by-case basis. She agreed to see me. She examined me. And she said, well, Mr. Kinney, I'm going to offer you the opportunity for me to do the surgery for you. You will never wrestle again. But if we don't do the surgery, you will lose the use of your arm, because it had gotten that bad, and the nerve damage and everything else. And so to me, it was just like, okay, I don't want to, and it was my right arm, and I'm right-handed. And I was just like, and my wife also was pregnant with our daughter at the time. And so I wanted to hold my baby, I wanted to be home. And I was also getting burnt out on the road too. I mean, because I was gone so often. So right. All of these things were kind of happening at once. And it was just, I recognized the nature telling me it's time to go. I didn't like it.
Right.
But I knew, and I was very jaded for it. So I finished out, it was 6 or 8 months I still had booked out. And I really just babied my shoulder to get through it all. And we just kind of picked a date on the map and did that as my initial final match. And that was going to be it. But it wasn't on my terms. And I hated that. And it never sat well with me. And I think that's why I struggled with it, is because it was just, I think if I would have never gotten hurt, there's a good chance I would have still been wrestling today. Right. But I think that with all of those things, they just lined up the way they did. And I knew that it was time to go, but I was devastated because of it.
And that was my next question. How difficult was it for you mentally to do this? You didn't do it on your own terms. And, whenever you hold on to something, it can turn into bitterness and harden you. Again, was there a moment there like, man, I got to shake this off because it's doing something to me that I don't like. It's changing me as a person. How did you deal with all of that?
Yeah, I recognize the changes. Don't get me wrong. I did. Right. I didn't care. I did a lot of self-sabotaging things because of it. Even there's something very interesting that happened during my journey back to wrestling in 2025. I unearthed a lot of photos of myself in those wrestling days. And what's really interesting is you can almost see it on me. Right. When I knew I was leaving wrestling. I went from wearing these bright colored outfits and all that kind of stuff to wearing black and keeping my face covered. And you could see it happening. I didn't recognize that at the time, that I was slipping. And I was treating people like trash. And I am not proud of the person I was that last year that I was in wrestling. I did not. And that always messed with my brain too, because I loved wrestling so much and I didn't leave it better than the way I found it. And that hurt me to my core because I did that to myself. That run I had with the Insane Clown Posse, that was during that last year. So I was already not in the right state of mind to be doing any of that, let alone being on the road with those guys for 2.5 weeks. So there was just all these things, man. And public enemy number one for that whole downfall of Gator Magraw was me. 100%. There's nobody else to blame. I stepped on people. I said things about people that I didn't mean, but I was so angry with everything that was going on that I didn't care about other people's feelings. And I was wrong for that. I was. So there was a lot of reflection happening after I left wrestling about that behavior that actually made my depression worse. The fact that the way I left wrestling and the way I left, the way I left it and the way I left it, I didn't like what I had done. And I felt so much guilt and remorse and anxiety, and I missed it so much. And it was really hard on me.
Last question, and this is a perfect thing to end on because it kind of goes into you talking to people and the things that people struggle with. How much of a struggle was it once you ended your career in professional wrestling for you to deal with your identity, with who am I now?
It was tough because I left wrestling and 2 months later I was a dad. So it was my turn to be a dad, and I thought I was ready for it. We bought a house and I thought I was ready for the responsibility. I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to college. I'm going to finish my degree. I didn't finish. I dropped out because I was on the road wrestling, and I chose that. I chose wrestling over my education. And I had started a new job that year and didn't know how it was going to go, but I liked it. I just didn't know what the future was going to have in store for me. And so I was just trying to do some new stuff, and again, drinking way too much. So I've got a baby now. And then the recession happened. We lost our house. That hurt. That didn't make things any better. I did end up during that time finishing my bachelor's degree, and I got an opportunity. My wife got pregnant with our twins, and I got an opportunity to get a full-time job with the company I was working for, but we were going to have to relocate from southern Minnesota to the Twin Cities. We weren't from the Twin Cities. We didn't know our way around. We didn't have any family there. And so we made that change. I took the job. So it's a new job, new environment, new family. Everything was so new, and it was happening so fast to me that I didn't recognize the person I saw in the mirror anymore. I was putting weight on so quickly. I think at my heaviest, when I got out of wrestling, I was about 230 pounds. The heaviest I got was about 275. And it was from drinking and eating like crap, and just, I wasn't taking care of myself, and I wasn't, and thus not taking care of anybody else. It was such a hard transition for me. Nothing for me I left wrestling in 2007. Nothing got better for me. I mean, my family was awesome. Don't get me wrong. It was great to be a dad, but my demons, nothing between my ears got better until I quit drinking in 2015. It was an 8-year gap.
Right.
And it was the hardest 8 years of my life, which also includes when my dad passed away. Yeah. And again, it was all self-inflicted.
Yeah. Yeah. We can end on this note. I know we're supposed to end on a happy note, but this is a good note to end on because we're going to go into after professional wrestling. It's an incredible story. Before we go off air, though, tell people about your book and where they can get it.
Yeah, I wrote a book, which is the extended version of my TED Talk. So if you like TED Talks, you could just look up Mike Kinney TED Talk, or it's on my website at kinneyconfidence.com. But I got an opportunity, and we can go into this later, but I got an opportunity to do the TED Talk. The TED Talk went viral unexpectedly. And then there was an opportunity for me to write the book, which is the extended version of the TED Talk, which is like a memoir of my time wrestling. It's called A Pro Wrestler's Guide to Confidence, and it can be found on Amazon.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on. I'm excited to get into part 2. Fans, I promise you in the next half an hour, you'll know exactly when part 2 is going to take place. Again, Thank you so much. You have such an incredible story. I think your story can help so many people, not just professional wrestlers. That's what's interesting. Things that you went through, not other people with their normal everyday lives can actually relate to the struggles that you went through. Guys, again, part 2 I will put up on my social media page within the next half an hour. I will be back tomorrow night with my co-host Bob Cook and Robbie Idol to discuss tonight's Monday Night Raw. Did we love it? Did we hate it? Was it just okay? I don't know. Tune in, subscribe. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss part 2. You guys have a great night. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.